On behalf of the Council for Emerging National Security Affairs, I am really thrilled to be sitting here with Peter Singer, who's currently a fellow at the New America Foundation. But that's not where his resume stops. I'm going to embarrass you for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation about some of the areas that CENSA and luckily Peter care about most in the emerging national security space. But if you aren't familiar with Peter Singer's work, he's the author of multiple award-winning books, not only nonfiction work on topics like robotics in war and children at war, but also a co-authored book of non-fiction, science fiction, called Ghost Fleet, which is a page-turner, to say the least. The Smithsonian Institution has called you one of the country's 100 leading innovators. Foreign Policy has called you one of the top 100 global thinkers. And you have, on top of your duties here, a technology firm and probably another book or two in the works, I'd imagine. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks.
I know you're busy to speak with us. So maybe we could just dive right in. CENSA is concerned with emerging national security affairs, so some things that have not been on the radar forever. Some would say that cybersecurity actually has been, but it has, of course, emerged more recently as a big topic. And I'm going to bring in some current affairs right now, and that's North Korea. So we're all concerned right now about North Korea maybe developing ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States. But looking back a couple years ago, they already did what appears to be a significant amount of damage by hacking a movie studio, Sony Pictures, and actually drawing federal, that is governmental, attention to this private act. Do you have some thoughts about just North Korea for the moment and where its hacking has gone, or where it's
Sure.
cyber?
So like most every other state out there, North Korea has invested in building up capability in cyberspace, building up the equivalent of what the United States has with Cyber Command to what China has with the Third Department. There is a rift, though. And we actually saw this not in the Sony episode, but more recently, where North Korea, because it's not a pretty functional economy, it's also been using its cyber capabilities to raise money. Basically, we've had regime-linked entities conducting cyber crime essentially as a means of raising money. So for example, last year there was the essentially theft in hitting a banking SWIFT system that you may have heard about, played out in Bangladesh, millions of dollars. Allegedly, that was linked back to North Korea. There were some more recent episodes. So there's a riff off of it. Now, what that illustrates, though, is sort of an emerging threat, an emerging capability, an ability to reach beyond North Korea, reach beyond Asia. However, we have to put it also shows we have to put it into context. So whether it was that crime to the Sony breach, the consequences, the physical consequences of that are in no way, shape, or form equivalent to what North Korea could do, not just with a ICBM that may or may not work,
right,
but the fact that they've, for decades, had thousands of howitzers trained on Seoul, Korea, where not just Korean citizens live, but over 100,000 American citizens live. So Americans have already been under physical threat. Mm-hmm. This gives them a new capability, but we kind of have to put it into its context. We have to put it into its weight. It's similar to when Sony was breached and you had some pundits and even politicians say, this is an act of war. Like, really? If a North Korean citizen had physically broken into Sony, stolen letters, not email, and stapled them to the outside, why would you consider that an act of war, and not when, for example, North Korean soldiers murdered in broad daylight American soldiers with axes in the DMZ, which actually happened? What I'm getting at here is cyber It's scary, it's new, it has real consequences, but we also have to weigh it compared to the old. And that allows us to not be pulled in by a lot of the kind of hype and hucksterism. So, I'm saying here, look, there's real issues, there's real concerns, there's new emerging threats, but we also can't be carried away by them.
These are great points. So let's take cyber security, as we're calling it, but cyber issues, and what sounds like an emerging cyber crime, I hesitate to say war, aggression kind of intersection, or state-sponsored cyber crime that normally would be done by private actors. Let's take that as itself. The United States is about to build up cyber security in a military command, as you noted before. Does this mean that that's an inappropriate place for it, or that we should be thinking in the national security realm writ large about the U.S. cyber capabilities differently?
What you're putting your finger on in both the threat side and our responses, real or potential, is that the traditional lines blur and the traditional buckets that we try and use organizationally or kind of mentally to organize things sometimes don't make sense anymore. So this example of Hold It, we have a state-linked organization conducting crime. Well, guess what? That's parallel to what Russia has been doing, where we've seen, for example, elements that have been engaged in cybercrime also engaging in information warfare activities to, we could go on and on. So there's a blurring of that. And oh, by the way, when you say North Korean, that doesn't mean actually, in all cases, physically located in North Korea. Right. So for example, we know of North Korean citizens who've been engaged in these operations, but they're physically located in other states, like for example, China, part of which is because they have better internet access there. Okay, same phenomenon if you think about cybercrime, if we're talking about Russia, right, where we've seen Russian cyber criminals operating out of Russia, but also physically located in other parts of, be it Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, and in turn engaging in, going after targets all over. Okay, so you've got that kind of blurring on the threat side. Same thing if we're thinking about how do we therefore divvy up organizational responsibility. It is completely appropriate and makes sense for us to build up U.S. military cyber capability, to build up that organization, to build up the staffing, the training, the equipping, to be able to deploy that. But in no way, shape, or form should we either think that is sufficient to defend the nation or think that that is where you should put the responsibility and the ownership of it. So if you're thinking about the types of threats that we've faced, everything from criminal threats to hacking of American political organizations of both parties and individuals of both parties, a Podesta or a Colin Powell, you wouldn't go, aha, U.S. military is the one that should solve that, because it might be happening outside the realm of armed conflict. It might be happening outside a state of war. We might be talking about a private network that you wouldn't want military being part of and doesn't have the expertise. So if we're thinking about how do I defend a power grid's email system, well, guess what? I shouldn't be looking to U.S. military to be the one. They neither know how that system runs well, there's all sorts of legal complications. So what you're talking about here is it reflects the internet itself. The internet itself is both public and private. It's created by the U.S. government, but everyone's using it in terms of we have multiple different companies that are running the infrastructure of it and ISPs to you and I are playing a role. So you can't think that you're going to solve this by just kind of militarizing it. And the problem in this space is everybody wants that very simple, easy answer. And instead, this is complex. We're talking about something complex that's going to have to involve a lot of different players, and you're never going to get kind of the 100% solution. because we may be talking about the virtual world, but welcome to the real world.
Right. I have the feeling that this is going to come up repeatedly in our conversation. I have questions written down that are about the military, or what are, writ large national security questions about, for example, weaponizing, cyber. And I would be interested in your vision. But I have the feeling that we're going to keep ending up in the space that you're talking about, where basic categories of what we consider national security or military activity are themselves being disrupted. And I wonder if we could just for a minute, if you have them, so you've laid out this landscape of needs and of the very beginnings, maybe the nascent beginnings of new ways of approaching complex threats and a complex territorial and non-territorial environment. Do you have a picture of the way the United States might go about these for example, these public-private partnerships?
Gosh, it really depends on the area, but in general, you want to understand how the landscape's changed. What are the types of threats? Where are they originating from? How are they organized? What are the key trends that are playing out? And those trends might be, in some cases, technologic trends, in other cases, political trends, demographic trends, whatever they are. And then try and have structures and build structures that are suitable for them. Right. So, the classic example that people turn to in our national security space is, for example, how when we looked at what do we do about the drug trade and smuggling in the Caribbean, you had responsibilities and expertise that was located in everything from U.S. Southern Command to the Coast Guard, to the Department of Treasury, to Miami-Dade Police Department, to the National Weather Service. I mean, and so instead of saying, okay, each of you do your own thing, or let's coordinate in a traditional way, they built a fusion center. They built an ability for people to plug and play. That in many ways became an inspiration for how we did certain things during counterterrorism operations in Iraq, and then you get to the McChrystal team of teams approach. I mean, the point is that we looked for new structures. In my mind, in a lot of this, you also want to be as multidisciplinary in your approach as you can. So we may be talking about new technical things that are either possible, or sometimes you need to understand that they're impossible. We recently had the president say, I'm going to create an impenetrable cybersecurity unit. Actually, any cybersecurity expert would say there's no such thing. Literally, the thing you want to create, it is impossible. So your goal from the start will never be met. So you want to have that kind of technical understanding, but in other cases it might be, hey, we need some social or cultural or even legal, ethical, historic understanding. So again, I hate to sort of say lock into one framework, but it's right. What are the types of attributes that you would want to approach it? What's the type of problem you're trying to solve?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that engages cyber too, right? From a different perspective, if you're going to have a network that involves police and a military command and possibly private actors who are working together to solve a problem, they also need cyber capabilities. And here I mean something quite basic, communication capacity. Is there less sexy than taking grids down and talking about that, but maybe there's a lot we should be thinking about there too.
I mean, you're hitting everything from one of the core needs in this space is information sharing. Mm-hmm. The ability for whether it's governmental organizations to share with the private sector, to different parts of the private sector to be able to share easily with one another, and vice versa, and do it in a timely manner. And unfortunately, government right now, the way it's structured, and also some legal things in place, is either unable or unwilling to be able to share the best and most useful things in a timely manner. Sometimes it doesn't come across, sometimes it comes too late, or other times it comes in a form that's not useful to either the current or potential future targets. We've seen that in everything from business cases to political motivated hacking. The world would be a very different place if the FBI had been able to communicate effectively with, for example, the DNC. Then you have the fact that private sector, as I mentioned, not able to share all that well. When it does, it's usually by sectors. So similar companies share well with similar companies. The attackers don't go, oh, okay, we'll follow those similar rules and we won't go after dissimilar companies. So there's just a lot, and again, the problems are everything from trust to liability questions. So notice how we were talking about cybersecurity, but we moved into things that cover everything from classification to communication to liability law. And yet the case episodes might be ones of clear national security consequence. I remember speaking with a leading U.S. general, a 4-star in this space, and he was lamenting about this ability to information share was to him a crucial part of building U.S. national security, and yet he had no capability over that. That's not his role. He knows it's not appropriate for it to be his role. To awareness building. The awareness building might be something that we talked about in terms of political leaders and Congress not being pulled in by hucksterism. To it might be awareness building in terms of cyber hygiene. Some of the most important breaches, both of classified U.S. military systems to corporate breaches, have happened when people haven't been following, the basics of this space, the equivalent of cover your mouth when you cough. And that then moves into things like education, the education at the level of our schools to education in terms of executive ed, political leaders. If you are in business, the military, or politics today, I don't care what part of it, not just the cyber part, you will be making some kind of cybersecurity decision. Whether you're in budgeting or you're on legal, you're in public affairs, you'll be making a kind of cybersecurity decision of some form. Do you understand the basics enough to make a smart decision? Probably not, at least for most people.
I have wondered that. How many people can sort of name the layers of the internet? Just as a
Again,
basic,
we're not talking about you have to know how to compute or program, but you at least ought to know what basic terms mean to what's either possible or impossible, so that not only you make smart decisions, but if you're in a public role, that you don't make decisions that are literally mockable. That you're not being the one going impenetrable, thinking that it's going to make you look smart, and instead it makes you look stupid.
Right. Well, that's a great segue to places where, at least to artificial intelligence in this way. At least cyber security or cyber issues have been around for a while, and you're illuminating the ways in which we're still, just us as people, are vulnerable to pressing the wrong button and popping ransomware onto our screens. Artificial intelligence, although also obviously a thing with a history of close to 100 years right now, is actually reaching a point where it appears to be emerging. I wonder, just speaking broadly for the moment, you, I am sure, have thoughts about how artificial intelligence will just change the world. Whether the kinds of pictures that are painted now, for example, of mass unemployment, are right or not right, and what else will change that we either already are expecting or that we're really missing.
So AI, I think the parallel with cyber security or cyberspace is that it's one of those things that was once science fiction that's become real. So cyberspace, it's literally a word created in science fiction in the 1980s, and now it's around us and we use it every day. Again, in whatever realm we're in, we depend on it, whether we're in media or national security or we're just trying to get our kids off to camp. Artificial intelligence is another one of those things, as you know, a long history of science fiction that is now becoming real. And much like cyberspace, we become kind of numb to how it surrounds us. So, AI is why your kids can't spell well. Autocomplete. Now, we've then moved kind of the standard, say, oh, no, well, that's not what we really mean by AI. We mean, no, something now that's taking on a hard human intelligence equivalent. And you're like, oh, like everything from diagnosing cancer, which actually algorithms now do a better job than top-trained human oncologists, to driverless cars. And so we're seeing it spread around us, just not in kind of that obvious way of how to you say, hold it, did you use Siri or did you use Google or whatever? So the point is it's growing, and it is of a remarkable already impact and potential impact moving forward. So you can see this in everything from our economy and our politics. So we're speaking in the wake of an election where one of the core topics was those foreigners are taking our jobs, particularly in manufacturing. Well, sorry, if you crunch the numbers, over 80% of it was not due to outsourcing to foreign countries. It was outsourcing to technology. It was automation. And guess what? Technology doesn't give it back. You can't bring it back. And that's already happened in manufacturing, let alone if you start looking at what comes next in fields that range from what we would describe as blue collar. So if you go on a state-by-state basis, in the majority of the United States, truck driver is the most popular, the most prevalent job. And yet, we starting to see driverless cars. To Budweiser had a commercial during the NFL playoffs showing an 18-wheeler driving away from a bottling plant and delivering beer, and then it celebrated, oh, isn't it awesome, this 18-wheeler is actually automated. You're like, hey, bud, that's really cool from one perspective, but if you're the truck driver sitting at home drinking a Bud, you just went, you probably swallowed deeply or spit out your beer. I mean, there's change there coming. There's change in traditionally white-collar jobs. As I mentioned, it might be in fields like oncology to lawyers. We've seen automation of everything from kind of your retail level law, automation of disputing traffic tickets, to automation of what we might think of kind of high-end, high billable hour law. For example, Wall Street financial firms automating already tens of thousands of hours worth of contract review. They would have paid Wall Street law firms hundreds of dollars an hour. Now they've got an algorithm for it. So there's a lot of these changes going on. Now, I think it's, and many others think it's equivalent to a new industrial age is how they frame it. And that's exciting if you think about that parallel. And there's all sorts of positives that come out of this. Greater efficiency, to that oncology example, lives saved. Same thing that the past industrial age, led to all these great wonders and modernity. Oh, by the way, it led to a huge amount of disruption in people's individual lives, to huge amounts of national security type disruption of everything from armed movements to origins of revolts, you name it. So I think we're in for a lot of change.
The picture you paint is actually pretty riveting and, as you say, exciting. So I want to ask about warfare in a minute, but just as you talk about truck drivers, as far as I know, the Army alone might be the U.S.'s largest employer. It has 1 million employees, something like this, on itself. But that is not even the whole workforce. What do these changes mean maybe for the national security workforce, I suppose, especially at war or in those sort of mobilizable
So we're already seeing
spaces.
Examples of it, and let me be clear, in no way, shape, or form, just like for that, are we saying there will be no more truck drivers or no more lawyers, but you may see less of them, or you may see them having less work, or you may see them located in different places or changing what they do. And that's the same phenomena that we see playing out in war, where the example would be of pilots. We already see pilots now physically located somewhere other than where they would have been before. So I'm flying over Afghanistan, but I'm physically located in Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. Or it's changing the organizational role. So I'm flying over Afghanistan, but I'm National Guard and I'm located in upstate New York, and my guard duty doesn't mean a traditional mobilization. It means I'm going in and out of shift work to the base nearby. It might mean, again, changes in the hierarchy. So do I need to be an officer to take on these roles? Or what does it mean for promotion structures? I mean, all of these things to, again, it's a disruptive effect. And we see the military, just like private businesses, going through this change and trying to figure it out. And just like in private businesses and the rest of society, you have some parts of it that are kind of pushing forward, maybe even pushing forward too rapidly, getting ahead of the technology or getting ahead of the best ways that we know how to use it. Or you see different parts resisting it. And they might be resisting it because they don't understand the technology. They might be resisting it because they see it as a challenge to their community, their tribe, their identity. Might be resisting because they see it as a challenge to a certain defense program. A great place to kind of watch this is what's happening in naval aviation, and what's happening as we, on one hand, have the art of the possible. We've already seen unmanned systems, drones, take on the toughest human pilot task, take off and land from an aircraft carrier, do it perfectly. But we have the then what, right? And that then what is, hold it, do I buy these systems? How many of them do I buy? How do I use them? Hold it, if I buy less of them, does that mean I'm getting the full use? But hold it, if I buy more of them, well, that means maybe I'm not buying as much of this defense program that has all this support. Or hold it, maybe that means I don't need as many Navy pilots. Ooh, these are the kind of questions that are playing out.
Right. The implications actually sound, well, one, unknown as yet, but at the very least dramatic.
I think that parallel of the first industrial revolution, or for the military, a different parallel that I think is useful, is the 1920s and 30s, where you can no longer say, oh, there's no such thing as a tank, or there's no such thing as a flying machine, or there's no such thing as a underwater boat. Nor can you say, well, you know what, tanks, planes, submarines, they're not useful. We've proven they're useful. The 1920s and 30s is, okay, but how am I going to use them? How many of them am I going to buy? And what's the best way? And you see lots of different debate, and no one really knew until it gets tested out there. There's an equivalent thing going on when you talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, even the cybersecurity side. No one can say they're science fiction anymore. No one can say, honestly, they're not important. No one can equally honestly say they know the best way to use these technologies.
It's probably an issue how to test them too.
Absolutely.
Especially when this really relates to warfare.
And that's one of the lessons I think we should take away from that historic period is, okay, what kind of testing, what kind of wargaming, what kind of experience can we be building? And the point, though, is not just to have the testing, it's also to be able to adapt and implement the lessons that are learned. And again, there's great lessons from back in the 1920s and 30s where, for example, the British were doing pretty great testing with things like the tank. They just weren't willing to take the things that they learned and implement. So instead, it's the Germans who are watching who get the blitzkrieg. And there's some, I think, parallels for the United States right now and how we think of other national security threats and what other nations are testing themselves and what they're learning.
Well, one of the things that really differs from simply the automating of tasks, which has gone on forever in the military and elsewhere, and artificial intelligence as it becomes more intelligent, is decision making. This seems an area of great concern, whether tested or not. Where do humans fit in this, essentially human activity of war?
So some people say this will never, ever happen. A human being moved out of the loop, so to speak, and they say, oh, we're not working on this technology. That's just not truthful. So for example, for our Ghost Fleet book, we identified 21 different examples of programs within the U.S. military that were about putting some kind of autonomy into a weapon system. And that is by no means the only ones, and they range from studying the use of this in carrier operations to automating anti-submarine warfare. An example of a robotic ship that can hunt enemy submarines on its own, which is not a dream. I've actually been on board. It's testing out in California right now. So now, will it be deployed? How will it be used? Those are separate questions from, we're definitely exploring this. Right. So what we're really talking about here, when you move from thinking about kind of automation or the use of unmanned systems so far, is a move of the human decision maker. We've already seen it geographically from the point of action. So the missile strike is happening in Afghanistan. The person is sitting in Nevada. Now, with autonomy, we're talking about chronologic dislocation. So there's a human role, just the person who's making the important decision is making it at some earlier point in time. And it might be the software programmer who's designing it to the mission commander who authorizes it. The point, though, is that the human role is moving, and our systems of laws and ethics in the civilian world and the military world don't have a perfect match yet for that kind of dislocation. And you can see this in everything from the dispute surrounding driverless cars already. So the driverless car gets in a wreck. Who's responsible? Was it the driver who didn't operate it in the exact manner that the business said they should, to no, business, you bear some liability because you should have expected that not everyone's going to be able to do it in this perfect way, to no, it's a software program. I mean, we're seeing those kind of debates already, to same sort of things you could play out in warfare of when the machine kills the wrong people. Is it the mission commander? Is it the programmer? Is it the, we'll have those debates. Another parallel of this is the kind of, do I judge it by point of action or the overall costs? So on driverless cars, what the manufacturers have said is, yeah, well, there was this accident where someone died, but if you crunch the numbers, way more people in general have lived because of this technology. So basically they've said, we're utilitarians. Same thing can be argued in war. Yeah, there may be a situation where there's a civilian casualty, but overall the drones are more accurate. And again, that's making a moral judgment about a technology issue. And that's where, again, you get that blend of topics.
Well, it really changes the location of the battlefield. You write fiction. I want to ask you, what's your worst nightmare? But after centuries, it feels like, after a century of movies where warfare is up close and people are, on a hot battlefield and the fog of war is actually there in the decision making. I suppose we've had a couple of generations of courtroom, but you're making it seem as though the battlefield itself is actually elsewhere.
We have these wonderful kind of, either real examples or what ifs. So if a U.S. Armed Forces officer pulls a trigger in Nevada and it kills someone in Afghanistan, well, we say, you know what, you're engaged in armed conflict. That was not murder. You were engaged in armed conflict. You were doing the job of someone in that role. That's appropriate. So we say, okay, well, let's play the inverse. A ISIS person kills that American officer in Nevada. Was that an act of armed conflict or an act of terrorism? And then people go, oh, but they were in the United States, it must be terrorism. Like, hold it, flip it. And you go, well, they go, okay, but were they wearing a uniform? And we go, well, was the soldier wearing the uniform? So are they killed on base or off base? Do we make the same judgment calls in Iraq or Syria? Well, oh, by the way, we're talking about taking on an armed combatant that by its very nature doesn't wear uniforms for a variety of reasons. It's an insurgency and the like. So what I'm getting at is that you can quickly see how these arguments sort of fall by the wayside, or they get more complicated. Or to give you a different example of autonomy, the United States has said if a foreign government targets an American unmanned plane, we still believe that to be an act of aggression, that plane, even though there's not someone physically inside it, has the right of self-defense. So we have the right to shoot back even if you didn't kill someone in this plane. Okay? Flip it. We've shot down Syrian Air Force drones. Did that mean they in turn had the right, therefore, to shoot back at the American fighter jets that shot the drone? Because you can, if that's the case, then we're in a very different world. But the point is, you can quickly see how these sort of debates, the old laws or interpretations, not only get more complicated, but you also have to make sure the argument that you're making for yourself applies if it's someone else, if you're trying to build some kind of norm. If you're just saying, well, the law, only apply, I get to go by a separate set of rules, well, then you're not creating a set of rules that everybody else is going to follow, right? You can't go then say, Russia, you broke the rules. Right. If you say, well, I'm allowed to break the rules too, but you're not allowed to break the rules, right?
When you see, so we need a new Geneva Convention. I mean, we need a new...
Maybe the problem, though, is...
Conventions.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing of the Geneva Conventions was that it had such universal agreement, and it's hard to imagine that in a lot of these areas right now. So instead, I think we're just going to continue to see kind of building blocks. I know, by the way, you need a political establishment that recognizes the value of things like the Geneva Conventions, which anyone in the military or the national security space would go, they are a good thing. And they're not just a good thing because they're moral, they're a good thing because they create a set of codes that have been to the advantage of the United States. Unfortunately, you've got this kind of chattering that somehow thinks they're bad for the United States. So again, it's not just can you build towards norms, you have people now who don't even understand the value of norms.
It's a pretty fragmented world and I suppose country,
yeah.
In many ways. What's your worst AI nightmare in warfare?
Yeah, I mean, well, then you get into like the sci-fi land of unleashing technology that no one understands, and there's not just the issue of civilian casualties, but some kind of escalatory where wars start because the humans didn't well understand the technology. But that we're kind of moving into sci-fi land, right?
Right. Or back to war games.
Yeah.
The movie, not the
Yeah. But again, when you to move to our prior discussion of cybersecurity is becoming a space that is almost inherently has to be automated because of not only the complexity and the amount of data, but the speed. It's hard for human decision makers to be in that. So we're seeing that as you play that forward, you can imagine something happens where an AI undertakes to defend a system aggressively, and sometimes defense means going out and finding who's attacking you. You can quickly see things escalate, and the humans escalating, we're talking literally kind of nanoseconds, where you might have interactivity that the humans don't get. I guess the real world version of this would be some kind of military parallel to the flash crash. If you remember a couple years back, you had this day on Wall Street where suddenly there was all of these trades that made no sense, and stocks were losing like 90% of their value in seconds. And what was happening was basically algorithms interacting, reading data, and having trades. And basically the way we reacted to it is we said, okay, that day didn't count. All the trades that happened that day, it just didn't happen. Let's just reset. You can do that, weirdly enough, on Wall Street with money. You're not going to be able to do that in war. And yet many of those same kind of parallel-like systems were moving into spaces of war.
I have to say, although I tend to not be alarmist, and I'm okay with the caveat that, well, we're moving into science fiction land, that complexity that you describe, that systemic problem of algorithms not covering every exception or example until it happens, sounds pretty
it's
viable
scary,
to
but again,
me.
then let's put on our history hat and go, okay, well, we had a period of time where first we had these new weapons that people thought were really useful, and therefore we should try and use them in as many scenarios as they could because they give us an advantage. They're called atomic bombs. And coming out of, when you look at the early Cold War period, you have the Dr. Strangelove types in reality, coming up with everything from atomic bazookas that we'll use on the battlefield. Because, oh, don't worry, radiation, to no, the best way to beat China in the Korea is to, well, let's just drop a couple atomic bombs. I mean, you can see those two. Then we get, okay, both sides having them, and we get these known episodes of global thermonuclear risk, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So then we get these other episodes that we only know about after the fact, like when there was a U.S. military exercise in the 80s that the Soviets almost thought was a sneak attack and were primed to fire. There was another episode in the 1990s after the Cold War had ended where the Russians, because of some censor difficulties, thought we were in the midst of launching a surprise attack, a nuclear attack. So again, like, this AI stuff, this cyber stuff sounds scary. Put it into context. There's these things that, we were in global risk before, and hopefully we can kind of learn from that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the point is. We also need to continually weigh it.
So maybe we'll keep learning. I suppose something that we're also not in control of yet is basically social media, another version of the world of cyber, but in particular, the meaning as opposed to the hardware and the systems that carry things. We're obsessed here right now. We're talking, but just outside these walls. Social media and the role that it played, or some sought to have it play, in an American election are being debated. Is that an area too where you see implications from now that maybe national security or military officials should be thinking about?
Oh, absolutely. And this is actually the topic of my next nonfiction book. So the internet itself has changed. Social media is basically the ability of each of us to become not only collectors of information, but distributors. We're running our own, kind of equivalent of websites, news services, and the like. That's the breakthrough. And then we're linked in vast social networks, which the companies behind them, in essence, are helping to, it's a space that it can be everything from vast marketplaces to vast marketplaces of ideas. So it is, without a doubt, changed everything from how companies do business to how people date, to how people are informed about political issues of the day, to it shaped the battlefield itself, how militaries, terrorist groups, insurgent groups operate. And the case examples range from of kind of illustrations of what's changed. The rise of ISIS. ISIS doesn't rise, doesn't kind of get to the top compared to its competitor Al-Qaeda, without social media, to its ability to recruit, to military operations on the ground. The first Battle of Mosul, ISIS launches a invasion. Usually when you launch an invasion, you try and keep it secret from the other side. D-Day would be a good example. Instead, ISIS does what any movie or video game release would do. It creates a hashtag and pushes it out as widely as possible. The hashtag is literally all eyes on ISIS, because it wants everyone to know, it wants to trend, it wants to go viral, because that actually has a physical effect on the battlefield. It causes kind of fear to spread among the defenders, and allows ISIS, with a smaller kind of 2,000 person invading force, to take over a city, beating a defending force of about 25,000. It allows ISIS to recruit, the story of, and also whether it's the 30,000 people that join ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to it allows it to operationalize afar. So the links to social media, people playing in the realm of terrorism in San Bernardino, Orlando, you name it. Okay, that's just the story of ISIS. Same phenomena can move over into our election. Donald Trump is not president without social media. And that's not just me saying it. Donald Trump literally, after the election, said, they asked him, how did he become president? How did he, he has a fundamentally different background. He approached it in a fundamentally different manner. In his first major interview, he credited social media. He said that's what allowed him to win. It's changed the way he's governed. It's changed the way we all interpret it. And again, it's not just him as an individual. We can see this in elections at the state level, but we can see it in countries all around the world. Guess what? In turn, we also see it has become a realm of influence operations and information warfare. We've seen Russia, for example, do this incredibly well. Both it's the ISIS style targeting individual defenders on the battlefield in Ukraine, to reaching beyond the battlefield to affect not just what people know, but what they think and how they emotionally feel in election campaigns everywhere from Hungary to Brexit to France to the 2016 American election.
Yeah.
And again, this is not debatable anymore. Okay. If you are trying to claim this didn't happen, to go back in history, there's a term for you that Russian intelligence came up with back before the internet. It was called a useful idiot. And the same phenomena now is playing forward of people who are allowing themselves to be used by a foreign government campaign to change hearts and minds and awareness of information inside our body politic. And this is real, and it's what's fascinating, to go back to our story of kind of traditional military aspects, is it has given Russia an incredibly outsized influence. We're talking about a nation that has the economy slightly smaller than Spain. Talking about it's the 13th largest economy and falling, and yet its power and influence has grown because of a skillful use of social media in influence operations, trolling, and the like. It's incredible.
You have just said so many provocative things. I'm really sorry that I didn't ask this question when we started, but I am aware that our time is drawing to a close and you need to move on with your day. Can I ask you one last question?
Sure.
It's a two-part. And it's about what people should be looking at that they're not. I wonder what you think the national security establishment, whether that is mainly the military or not, what are they missing? What do you wish you could say? Look at this. And is there anything that sort of separately, we citizens, we people who, as citizens, aren't seeing about the future unfolding in front of us that we should attend to?
Again, back to sort of one of the themes of our conversation, I wouldn't even break it down into, well, this is what the national security people should see, and this is what the civilian side should see. What we tried to do in the Go Sleep book was help people understand the incredible trends that are playing out, many of which are, we're talking not about futuristic things, we're talking about things that are already real, whether it is technologies that are literally going to change the way we organize our businesses, lead our personal lives, conduct our wars, things that have been science fiction that are now real. We talked about artificial intelligence or robotics. Some of the things that are going on in energy are amazing. The historic equivalents are things like the steam engine, the computer. Did the steam engine change the world? Did the computer change your world? We're having the equivalents playing out. You better be aware of them. You better not be in denialism towards them. You better think, how is my organization, how's my business, how's my military unit trying to change to ride this trend? And there's other geopolitical trends. So, one that we haven't talked about is the rise of China. It's no longer rising, it's catching up. It's becoming a power of, again, an economic power, political power, a military power. And that changes the way we need to think about everything from military side. You think of the experience of a Navy officer in the Pacific is going to be fundamentally different when there is a China with 4 aircraft carriers, 99 submarines. Again, I'm not talking about what if there's a war. I'm just saying literally the balance of power is different to how we think about things like higher education. America's colleges and universities are one of the jewels of the crown of our national power, and you should care about them being good, whether it's for your kids to have a great school to go to I care about America's competitiveness in a future economy, a future military world. Well, guess what? They're falling behind, and that two needs to play. It's not just the story of the challenges they've had and people defunding them or going after them in issues of immigration and chasing away great foreign students to, guess what? China's been investing in its own universities and R&D labs to get better. So that, what I'm trying to get at here is that would be another trend of understand the stakes. It's not just about how are we doing on our own, it's that we are in a very different kind of world, a very different kind of race, and that should mean that you should be doubling down on America's strengths and trying to shore up our weaknesses instead of trying to take away our strengths and make us even weaker.
Right. What a great answer. So don't be in denialism. Possibly read Ghost Fleet.
Not possibly, definitively.
Do read Ghost Fleet. I didn't know whether, I want to leave room for modesty, but go read Ghost Fleet. And on behalf of CENSA, I really want to thank Peter Singer for spending an hour with us and talking about the emerging trends that are critical to national security and to us as a country.
Great, thank you.